Welcome to DireDen. I am here with Jake from the Wisdom Check channel, and Jake has a great channel full of Pathfinder 2 content. I'm bringing Jake on today to talk about the role of referee. Like, as a game master, what is being a referee like for you? So, Jake, welcome.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. And I'll quickly say about Jake's channel that he does, like I said, some really cool Pathfinder 2 content, but Jake's also coming from 5e. Like, you made the transition not that long ago from 5th edition to Pathfinder, right?
Right. It was shortly after the OGL issue happened that I realized, people are all pissed off at WotC. Let's try a new system.
Yeah.
So I tried Pathfinder 2, and it caught on to me because it was so similar to 3.5, which I freaking loved. And there was a lot in it for me to digest. Like, it was clearly a big constructed system. Like, there was a lot to learn. So I like learning. So that was an appeal to me.
I've always heard, like, the biggest complaint I've heard about Pathfinder 2 is that it is a pretty steep learning curve. Like, there's a lot there. So what was that like transitioning from 5th edition to Pathfinder 2?
Daunting, scary. I didn't really know where to start. So I man, what was the first thing that I did? I think I just looked online for anything that was Pathfinder, and I found their wiki. And then I stumbled upon the website that has all of the rules indexed for Pathfinder, and I didn't want to buy books for a system that I was just exploring, so I just read the rules. It's Archives of Nethys. It's just a very convenient system, or sorry, a very convenient website that has all of the rules for everything, including stuff that comes out in adventure modules. It just doesn't have adventures or lore or most of the art. So, like, there's still reasons to buy the books, like adventures, but you can still make anything you need to with the website. And so I started there, and if not for that, I probably wouldn't have started learning Pathfinder 2, because I don't like buying books for a new system. But it was a lot to swallow and digest, so I think I just started with what would I like to play in that system, and I went from there. I was like, I'd be this character. How do I make that character? And so that was my origins. It was easier to ease in that way.
Right. Because you play such a robust system, I thought you would be a perfect person to talk to about adjudicating rules and making rulings, as we're talking about the role of the referee as the game master. But also because you recently made that transition, and I know a lot of my audience has made a transition from 5e to another version. Like, I know from all your comments out there that a lot of you are, playing third party 5th edition, or you've moved to Shadowdark, or you've gone backwards to 3.5. So, there's a lot of you out there I know that are playing different systems and have recently made a transition similar to Jake. So I thought he would be a great guest to talk about all this stuff.
I am. No, I've played a lot of 3.5. I love 3.5 and basically 3.75 Pathfinder 1. If you like 3.5, there's basically the same complexity with more restriction and balance, as in, like, the numbers don't inflate so much in
Mhm.
Pathfinder 2. And it's it's so similar that you might even just, like, relax starting Pathfinder 2 because it's so familiar.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that was one of the reasons why I loved 5th edition for me, because I had played all the other editions of D&D up until that point, and like 5th edition just really fit like a glove for me because I could see all the design elements and how they connected the dots. And there's so much of 5th edition that reminded me of 1st edition and reminded me of 3rd edition, right?
Oh
There's
yeah, not just the core fantasy either.
Right, yeah, the design concepts and the roots of the system are kind of this, like, distilled down version of all the previous systems, and that was something I really appreciated about it. So, and I think that's kind of when it comes to choosing the right system for you, it's, it comes from, like, this place of, like, what do you understand about game design? What are the game design elements that you really appreciate? Because that's going to help you adjudicate the rules better if you're, connected and identify where all these rules are coming from.
Yes, and I want to say that part of that desire for me is the desire for realism, but it's not really realism. People use that a lot in role playing games, and it doesn't really make sense to use it in a fantasy game. What I mean is, are there provisions for things that are logical to come up? Like, how do you jump across a 10-foot chasm? How do you push somebody off of you if they're lying on top of you and you're prone? I like that there's a lot of things that are considered. It's a very considerate, very thoughtful game.
Right. So while you were talking about how, like, it has this steep learning curve that was a little daunting at first, like, overall, you feel like now the system supports your style of play well.
Yeah, well, it's because of who I am. Like, I I get paranoid when I don't have a safety net. So I
Hmm.
want to know and have the assurance that something exists out there for something I want to do. And then if I think that that is going to work mostly, but I need to tweak it, great. I'm fine tweaking it once I understand the rule. It's like understand the rules so you can break them. Know what you're doing so that you understand how to have the same influence later on the opposite side so things generally stay balanced. Like if you want your party to be able to fly, okay, but there's going to have to be like dust storms and toxic clouds and other flying enemies.
Right. So, like knowing the rules and how to implement them, but then at the same time knowing what your players want and the story that you're trying to tell as a group, and figuring out how the rules help make that happen.
Yes.
So, along those lines, then, when it comes to making rulings or adjudicating rules, like what would you say is your best advice to give game masters out there when we think of the game master as a referee?
Like understand what you're there for and your flaws about that issue. Like if you take personal pride in every NPC you create, then you're going to be hurt when somebody kills an NPC. So don't do that if you can. Understand yourself is what I'm saying. But aside from that, understanding the people around your table matters most. But before you can do that, you kind of have to develop how to communicate. Like you can't understand what's inside their head if you don't have a process by which they can get that out and you understand it. So learning interpersonal communications, at least the basics of how to reflect what somebody is saying to you in a way that makes sense to them and sounds original like you did think it through
Hmm.
to build a basis of understanding and a relationship is important to allow everybody's creativity to flow because you need to communicate before you can role play.
That's a great point. Yeah, that role playing is a form of communication, and so adjudicating the rules and being the referee also requires communication.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we lose track of that, and I think it's a good point that role playing games probably have the most communication required of any type of game.
Oh yeah, board games you could probably just shut up the whole time. In fact, I played chess with a guy who just had his hoodie on the whole time and earphones in and just stared down at the board. It was annoying.
I could see that, and he may have like kind of scored some intimidation points doing that as well.
I think he did. I lost a couple of times in a tournament from him.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a great example of how like that's a game you can play without talking to your, the other player one bit, right?
Yeah.
Where like there's no way you could just come to a role playing game and never say a word, right?
Yeah, you really can't. Like, I had a player once who did show up and say very little. I understand he was shy, but somehow, like, he played a character who spoke Celestial, and he decided to roleplay that as speaking Japanese because he spoke some Japanese. The dude was American. I spoke with him in English. I mean, I'm pretty sure he was like naturally born here, but he said very little else. And like trying to pry information out of him about where his character was going or what he was doing was so difficult. And it doesn't make fun for anyone, including him. So we would just like hear this random babbling sometimes, and that's not really engaging with anybody.
Right. Right. And so that becomes a factor in all this, right? That being a referee isn't just about rules lawyering, right?
No, it's about knowing how to talk to people too.
Right. Well, so before we move on to that point, though, just kind of wrap up the rules part and the rulings part. What are what are some of the like challenges that you faced when it comes to like adjudicating rules at the table, and like maybe some examples of how you overcame sticky situations with rules?
Well, first off, I only learned these things by making horrible mistakes, like letting somebody who knew science convince me that Greece was also napalm. I don't know. I was dumb. I didn't know much about the world. So there are a lot of instances that are going to come up that you have to figure out what rules work in the situation, and every time the things that are going to be constant are your players. So
Hmm.
no matter what the rule is supposed to be or what action they're taking, it's still the same people. So you need to speak to them and how they would think it makes sense to do this in game. If you have a rules lawyer, you talk to them a specific way. If you have somebody who wants like narrative combat, like a guy in my live stream, he doesn't really care as long as it sounds cool. Like he doesn't care what he has to roll or do. He just wants to do the thing so he can make fun things happen for him. So it really depends on who your people are, which is why communication matters so much, and maybe even interviewing them before they start the game, so you can find out where they're coming from. or if they are even okay with rules. I know that sounds silly, but it could matter. Like this dude that I just mentioned who likes narrative combat, I had no idea he meant narrative combat. He said cinematic combat. So I'm like describing stuff, and he's like, "Oh, I have to roll dice." Uh, like I don't even know how we got here. So questioning people, making sure they understand the same ground rules, that's really important too.
Yeah, well, like for example, I have a player who's really thorough with the rules. He's a very good optimizer, builds great technical characters, right? He always knows what he's doing on his turn. Like he knows what's going to be a bonus action, he knows what's going to be his action, he knows what's going to be a
Cool.
move action. Like he's on top of it, right? But then I also have that more narrative minded player who just is he's going to keep doing stuff and you till you tell him he's out of actions. Like and I finally had to just figure that out that I just have to tell him no. Like no, you can't do it anymore. And he's like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." Right?
Yeah, you've done four things. How many more? All right.
So, and it's not like he's trying to cheat or break the rules. He's role playing. So he's
Right.
like,
To him, it's a story he's telling.
right. And so you have to step in and cap it at what's reasonable. Because in my mind, now I know when it's his turn, I'm keeping track of what's an action, what's a bonus action. I'm keeping track of
That's
that. So,
wise.
so I know when to tell him that that's enough. That's as much as you can do in this 6 seconds. It's Amy's turn now. Shut up, Austin.
Yeah.
But but yeah, that's part of the refereeing of the game is not just knowing the rules, but knowing when and how to implement them. And then the third layer, what I hear you saying is knowing how to implement them in a way that relates to your player's style of play.
Yeah, I like that layering analogy. It's a good idea.
So with that, when are when do you have to lean on the rules? Like what is good about having rules?
Oh, what an interesting question. So, the rules are there to perpetuate interactivity and fun. So, if you are building a character, obviously you follow the rules of character building. If you are in a combat where some of the players' actions might conflict with each other, then that's the time that you go, okay, so I need to know the rules first so that I know what should be the case. But otherwise, know what the rules are and then make your own decision about how you want this to play out. And it isn't necessarily about what makes sense to you, it's about how these two players, these people that are interacting with the rules, it's about what they expect and want out of the game and out of what they're trying to do. And that's down to knowing the people. And sometimes that just is going to come up in the moment where you're like, okay, so what are you trying to go for? What's your goal here? And clarifying if you don't understand multiple times is fine until you get to the root of the matter. It might annoy people at first, but they will in the end really appreciate that you see their perspective.
Right. Like that storytelling player that I have, right? He always wants to use his grappling hook to do shenanigans. He, he's always looking for ways to interact with the environment. He dropped a bed on a zombie one time, right? Pushed the bed out the window and crushed the zombie from
What's the damage on a bed? What's it made out of? Is it filled with feathers?
right. Like so, he's always trying to do that sort of thing,
Wow,
and that was a learning curve for me because it's fun. Like he comes up with these crazy ideas,
totally.
but I have to then, like you just said, I have to understand the intent, right? So when he's trying to pull some weird shenanigans, like I run the grappling hook and the rope from this point to that point to that point, and I'm like, so are you trying to trip the monster? Are you trying to restrain the monster? What are you trying to do with this rope contraption that you just made, right? So I'm trying to take his colorful description and try to interpret that into a rule that I already have. Like, is it a shove? Is it a trip? Is it a grapple? Like, what do you,
And
right?
sometimes they'll just be making up BS on the fly.
Right, and sometimes you do, like when he drops the bed off of the second story balcony onto the zombie. Like I don't know how much damage that does, but let's make something up, right? So yeah, so I think that's a great point. That part of being a referee is not just understanding the rules, but understanding the players, right?
Yeah, and it's important to not just hand wave everything because
Mm,
if you do, then it reflects to the other players around you that sometimes you're not going to make them make roles. Sometimes you're just going to say, "Okay, it happens," and then it becomes a personality conflict or personality issue. When they want something to happen, you say you have to roll for it, and they ask why. So make sure that you do use fairness in all situations, and the fairness is easier to do if you apply rules and roles.
right, yeah, that's a great point. Is that you need a certain amount of fairness so that there's not a perceived favoritism.
Yeah.
I know that was something that one of my players commented on, that it's kind of seemed like one of the other players was becoming the main character
Uh,
because they were so into the role play and giving all these colorful descriptions, right? That I need to make sure that just because his turn takes more time because he's being more descriptive, that there's still a sense of fairness between everybody else, and that his character doesn't look like, you know, that's my favorite character or that's my favorite player and he's the main character, right?
yeah.
That was another hurdle that we had to overcome in my group. So, but with along that line of thinking, right? You say that you do need to have rules to create that fairness. So the rules become an important part of the game because otherwise it's just storytelling, right?
Right, and that's fine if that's the kind of game that you want to play, but for most of us, we want something more involved than that, and storytelling it by itself gets difficult to believe in the end because then there's no conflict except whatever people have as a whim. And so having rules and guidelines and roles and difficulty and randomness, that does part of our storytelling for us. It makes it easier to imagine what's happening in our head because we don't relate to a world that just is story and everything goes perfectly fine.
Right. While we might want to live in that world, it's we don't, right?
Right,
We
like in the Matrix, they said that the first Matrix was designed to be a paradise, and we lost whole crops. Nobody could accept the programming because we don't.
Right, yeah, that's a great point. That matrix analogy is an excellent point, right? The idea that a good story is going to have conflict. So the boundaries provided by the rules and the boundaries provided by the failed dice rolls,
Hmm.
right? That creates conflict and limitations. And then the problem solving of those conflicts and limitations is what drives the story forward. That creates a narrative when the players go, well, that didn't work. What are we doing next?
Right, it forces ingenuity and innovation.
Exactly. And that's the fun of the game, right? When the players feel like they have overcome, when they feel like they've outsmarted you or they've outmaneuvered the bad guys and they've succeeded despite the barriers, right? If there were no barriers, then it's too easy. There's no challenge to it.
Right, like your cloaker thing you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that was a good example too of when a rule doesn't exist, right? Like dropping the bed on the zombie. And what Jake's talking about is this story I told him um, about my players who killed the cloaker, and they were in a dungeon with a series of waterfalls. And so this I describe where they kill this cloaker, how it like crashes down into the water and kind of floats on the surface, like a big manta ray that the thing looks like, right? And the players are like, "Can we ride on it? Because it's large, right? And it's floating and it's this like kite shaped creature. Can we just ride it downriver?" And so on the spot now there's like, well, there's no rules for riding a dead cloaker downriver.
Strangely enough.
Right. They described what they were doing and we're like going to stick a dagger in its skull and use that as you know as kind of a steering wheel to point it in the direction we want to go. And then the other two get on the wings of this thing and they're gonna pull on the wings, you know, to control it like flaps on an airplane. And then the other person's in back, with the tail, like using it like a rudder. So I'm like, all right, so there's four of you that are on this manta ray. So the two on the wings need to give me dexterity checks. The two that are steering from front and back need to give me strength checks. And if you succeed 3 out of 4, you're gonna ride this thing downriver and sail over the waterfall. But I have to set the stakes, right? So if you don't get 3 out of 4, this thing's gonna nosedive over the waterfall and you're gonna dash yourself upon the rocks. So now we have stakes and we have rules, and they know they have to succeed 3 out of 4, and the first person rolls and they fail. Now there's tension because they know that the other three have to succeed or they're going to take damage when they hit the rocks at the bottom of the waterfall. And of course they succeeded, and it was this great moment of describing them like flying this thing like a hang glider off the edge of the waterfall and floating down to the next layer of the dungeon. And it was great. It was this great cinematic scene, but we set it up with clear parameters. Here's how this is going to succeed. Here's how it's going to fail. Now roll.
Right, and what I've noticed before is, like, if they have, like, a roughly a 40% chance of success, it means a lot to them, because then it's really difficult for them to succeed at it, but if they do, it's amazing.
Right. Yeah. You want, and I think the math of both Pathfinder 2 and fifth edition bear that out, right? That
Mhm.
you kind of have this kind of magic window of about 40 to 60% of success, like somewhere around 50, maybe a little better than 50% chance of success.
Yeah, and
And
I like that example. And I also, while you were talking, I thought of a BS explanation for that in the rules. In the actual rules, it's an analogy though. So a beholder cannon, when it's dead, some of its internal organs still float. So you can take them out and hold them like balloons. This is also an aberration, the cloaker is, potentially with similar biology, so it might still levitate after it's dead.
that's a great point. Yeah. So now we have an in-world explanation for why it was as easy for them to do, and sail past an entire level of the dungeon that I had prepared.
And really nobody cares that that it is improbable. That's the appeal of it. Setting up the rules is really just something for their mind to say, okay, I have this tangible thing that seems realistic that I could grab onto so my logical side can go away, and then they can have fun.
Right. It's the suspension of disbelief, right?
Hmm.
You want to have enough rules in place, or description, I should say, and description in place to suspend that disbelief, so that it doesn't seem like this is just completely implausible,
Right,
right?
we have to relate to it, or it doesn't seem like anything we can believe, and we're not having as much fun.
Right. And the rules can help us do that. Going back to the fact that these rules set parameters, and you're using those parameters to create challenge, and that challenge creates dramatic tension, right? So, shifting gears, because we did say that the other part of being a referee is not just adjudicating the rules or making rulings, it's also a matter of dealing with, players and their conflicts at the table. Like, part of the refereeing is helping your players relate to each other, understand each other. What are your thoughts, kind of examples of when you've had to referee player player conflict, not player character conflict?
First off, that all comes back down to interpersonal communications. And you need to, okay, so it helps at the beginning of a game gathering together before you really make characters and start in world to have a session zero that establishes guidelines for communication. And they're not just things like don't be a jerk, don't go off on your own, make sure you tell me what you're doing. It's also things like here's how we're going to communicate. If you have a personality conflict or an issue out of character, tell me about it. I'm going to reflect to you what I understand from it. If that's wrong, you clarify for me. If it's right, great, we'll go ahead and talk to the other side of the conversation or something to that effect. There are a lot of different, I should say, there are a lot of guides on how to communicate, how to establish interpersonal communications between a group of people, but they all come down to really similar things. Make sure that the person that has the complaint feels heard, not just is heard, because you can't judge that. They have to have the acceptance emotionally, or there's still some sort of conflict there.
Mhm.
So,
Great
however that
point.
needs to happen, communicating back and forth to really rule out that you might misunderstand, to make sure you're on the same page, and then say your perspective or the perspective of the other person if there's maybe a conflict between two players, and say what you think could be a possible solution to this scenario. No matter what you say and no matter what you think is going to happen, it's important to take time during these conflicts, because if you rush things, somebody is still upset. They might all be upset, who knows? But as maybe grating on your pride as it is, or annoying as it might be, you need to take a step back, not be personally involved, and
Mhm.
try to understand everybody's perspective and come up with a solution that works for everyone.
I heard like several great points in there. So, so,
Sorry for talking.
so one of those was like, you've got to check your own pride, right? Which is something
Yeah,
we do as DMs on a regular basis, right? Like,
we should do.
we should do, right? Like, when my players sailed the cloaker downriver, they bypassed an entire level of the dungeon. I, you know,
Right.
I didn't get my feelings hurt, by the fact that they passed up all that content I had prepped, right?
Yeah,
Because
because it's not about you.
right, it's a cool moment. It was very cinematic, so I let it slide. I didn't get my feelings hurt that they skipped the troglodyte encounter and the Grick encounter or whatever, right? Um, so getting your pride out of the way. And then the other part of it that I heard you saying is like trying to understand both sides, right? Trying to make sure both people feel heard, right? And that is similar to, adjudicating rules when you have two people who have a disagreement over the rules,
Yeah.
right? You say, okay, explain to me your interpretation of the rule,
Right.
explain to me your interpretation of the rule, and I'll try to figure out where you're both coming from and what makes the most sense according to the rules, right?
Hmm.
It's a little bit more difficult because when it comes to interpersonal conflict, there's not a rule book.
No, there is not a human psychology rule book that is 100% right.
Exactly. So, but you're still doing the same skills. You're still trying to hear what the other person is saying
Yeah.
and what this person is saying and understand where they're coming from and how they are interpreting the situation.
Right. It's the most important thing to put yourself to remove yourself from the situation as much as possible emotionally. Understand that the entire game is not about you. Yeah, you're running it. Yeah, you're coming up with fun stuff to do, but you're just another function of the game system. You are there to help perpetuate fun. And if they have a problem with something, it's not about you. Even if it's about you, it's not about you. It's about their perception of what's occurring to them.
Right. And the goal is not to squash it so you can go back to having fun, right?
Right.
The goal is to understand them, help them work through it so you all get back to having fun.
Right. It doesn't matter who's right or wrong. And this is something that I was told in marriage counseling quite a while ago. Um, would you rather be right or married?
Right. I've actually said that to people. Would you would you rather be right or would you rather be happy?
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess kind of one last question along those lines is so how do you get good at
Okay, well, make mistakes and try a lot.
that?
But if you want shortcuts, there are guides out there on interpersonal communication, including methods on mirroring exercises and how to be objective and reflect on what your own issues are or your own bias in that situation. There are guidebooks that are for free. If you want a video version, I have one on my website. No, sorry, not my website, on YouTube, um, about how to de escalate a situation. And there's a lot more detail than even that video. If you want more information, let me know in the comments of that video, and I'll try to point you in the right direction for resources. But essentially, it's a new skill, and you have accepted to do this task, whether you're good at it or whether you even realize you're accepting that. Because this group that you're running, if you're the GM, looks to you because you're the one running the story. You're the one in charge. Even if you don't want the responsibility, you got it. So if something falls apart in the game, I'm not saying it's all your fault. People have their own perspectives. They're going to make their own mistakes and they're going to make their own actions based on judgments they have that are incorrect or at least unhelpful. But if you have these skills, you can resolve those much faster and much more positively for everybody involved. So interpersonal communication, learn what you can about it.
That's a great point. And like nobody hesitates when someone gives the advice of, well, if you want to be better at improv, go take an improv class. If you want to be better at storytelling, go read some books or watch videos about how to be a storyteller, right?
Right.
We don't hesitate to tell people if you want to be better at that, go learn it, right?
Hmm.
But that's true. Like I think that that's a really great point that you just made that to get good at communication, you have to study, you have to learn, just like any other
Right.
skill set, you have to develop
You could make mistakes instead, but that's going to take a lot longer to learn.
it. Right. That's also such a truth of life, right? There's always the easy way and the hard way to learn something.
Yeah. And maybe you need the hard way. Maybe learning all of these facts and figures and platform for discussion. I have spent 10 hours in a single conversation before. It's not fun. But, I was stubborn and I didn't learn and I had to go through pain. Don't do that. Please try to put your pride aside, your personal blocks, understand yourself and learn how to communicate with others.
Excellent, excellent advice. So, real quick before we wrap up, thanks for coming on the show. And do you
Yeah.
have anything cool coming up? What do you have going on your channel or in your world?
Well, the Pathfinder 2 world is actually quite busy right now. Previous to this month, there have been two other releases of books that have added a lot or changed a lot in the system. And it's almost all just to get out from underneath the OGL 1.0 so that Pathfinder can do its own thing and have its own definitions for stuff. But they've had to produce books fairly quickly because of it. So there have been a lot of videos that I've been able to make based on those new books. So if you want to check out um, Player Core 2 information is what I'm doing right now. If you want to check out Wisdom Check, my videos are instructive on the new stuff. But if you look at the older videos that I have class instructions and archetypes, so you know the mechanics of how to build in the system. But if you're just sort of casual and you just want to like get a feel for how people play this game, you could like watch the live streams on Fridays at 3 p.m. Pacific, or go to the build videos that I have, because I have a backstory at the beginning that's really rich. And throughout the character build, I refer back to the backstory and say, we're doing this because he was raised by a vampire.
Right. So even somebody who's not specifically building a character for Pathfinder 2 can
Yeah,
benefit from those videos because it's a cool character concept, and you show how to take the concept and create it with the existing rules. So you could translate that to another game system as well.
totally could.
But yeah, there's a lot of cool concepts in those videos. I like watching those.
I'm glad. I actually rewatch them sometimes or reread the scripts because they're fun.
So, well, thanks again for coming on the show, and thanks all of you out there for visiting the Dire Den, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.